tight program. Each presenter here will have about 4 minutes to speak. If you speak beyond it, I will cut you off, okay? All right? I want a tight program because I want the question portion of the program to be just as fruitful. So we're going to begin with an overview by Professor Marcia Darling of Adelphi University.
To thank Legislator Szilard for inviting my participation in today's Lifting as We Rise Black History Month program. I should say, as I read along, I'm going to be editing now that I only have 4 minutes.
I knew at Georgetown, you could have
and Carrie was one of my best students when I taught Carrie at Georgetown before you went to law school. So I'm additionally pleased and very proud. So let me begin my comments today on the state of Black Nassau County by noting what I believe we all know, which is that according to the 2000 and 2010 census, the 2 counties comprising Long Island continue to be among the most racially segregated regions in the nation. Is that better? Data from those reports confirm that racial segregation between whites and blacks is extremely high, and segregation between Latinos, the fastest growing racial ethnic group on Long Island, and Asians and whites is increasing. So what is observable according to an article on demography of racially segregated counties like Nassau, the article is entitled The State of Segregation in Suburbs, is that invisible racial fences separate most of the county's residents. The article begins by contrasting 2 villages that we know well, Hempstead and Garden City, that are adjacent to one another. Hempstead has a median household income of $52,000. Garden City's median household income is $150,000. Hempstead in areas resembles an inner city with bodegas, laundromats, and low-rise apartment buildings. Garden City is an idyllic suburban community with tree-lined streets, gourmet grocery stores, and large colonial homes. Garden City is 88% white, and Hempstead is 92% black and Latino, split about evenly. I'm going to scroll down. Recently, the work of a social scientist, John Logan at Brown University, has concluded that within Nassau County, there are hardly any changes in the degree of segregation. The predominantly minority areas are becoming more minority, and the predominantly white areas are staying mostly white. This data compares with what we see going on in Prince George's County in Maryland, Arlington County in Virginia, and the suburbs of St. Louis. Now, this research challenges a long-standing belief that as members of minority groups gain income, that their access to better suburban communities increases, and hence better real estate-based wealth building capacity, better schools, better healthcare opportunities, etc. So to be clear, there has been progress, but let me ask you, how should we get our heads around the fact that Nassau County, like other suburban counties, is becoming more diverse and unequal at the same time in terms of wealth building assets, schools and education, and other indices? And also, how do we get our heads around the fact that a black household that earns upwards of $75,000 a year lives in a neighborhood with a similar exposure to white people as a black household that earns less than $40,000 a year? So if you see the role that race plays in our lives here in Nassau County, then perhaps you discern in both the data and in our observations that Nassau County is more segregated by race than income. And racial segregation impacts diversity. Diversity should be a social asset, but it is often not a material benefit because of continuing segregation and the separate and unequal schools and increasing poverty levels that racial segregation maintains. So, as you consider these concerns, bear in mind a knee-jerk reaction that is often offered as a response. One opinion goes something like this. Well, people choose to live with others like themselves. So blacks, Latinos, and Asians and others choose to live among each other no matter their income and class differentials. Another time-weathered response focuses on the incidence or prevalence of individual racial attitudes, on who is and is not racist, in other words, confining the analysis to instances of racism at the individual level. So let me bring a different level of analysis to these 2 concerns. First, because for a very long time, white supporters of racial segregation have argued in defense of their racial exclusion of minority groups that they have asserted that for sure, blacks, Asians, and more recently Latinos really do not want to live around whites anyway. Historically, whites created the racial and economic segregation that has continually evolved into the social system many of us live with. Secondly, I would be among the last to cast aside the importance of personal racial attitudes, beliefs and behaviors in assessing the scale and magnitude of racial segregation in Nassau and Suffolk counties, or their impact in devising effective interventions and remedies to the longstanding challenges to racial fairness and economic equity we confront here on Long Island. But I suggest that we direct our conversation towards an analysis of the structural and institutional forces that create and at this point sustain racial disparities. For in fact, these are the real equity challenges that we face. Racial and economic segregation are responsible for the concentrated poverty alongside affluence that characterizes Long Island's two counties. Stated plainly, many racially and economically segregated communities are isolated from enabling life opportunities, which in turn deepens inequalities. The inequalities of opportunity that one sees here on Long Island are largely a consequence of structural and institutional choices, decisions, and practices that advantage some communities and deprive others. Some years ago, legal analyst John Powell of the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota authored a landmark report entitled, and I quote, "Racism and the Opportunity Divide on Long Island," close quote, on behalf of the Erase Racism initiative of the Long Island Community Foundation. In addressing structural racism and promoting opportunity, Powell noted, and I quote, "The inequalities of opportunity found on Long Island do not arise by accident, nor do they result solely from interpersonal racism. Governmental policies and institutional practices generate and perpetuate segregation and the disparities that it creates. We focus on structural racism because it is often ignored in efforts to address racial inequality, even though it plays a primary role in shaping our lives by affecting our access to decent housing, quality education, good jobs, and other life opportunities," close quote. So institutional racism is the policies and practices of large institutions that perpetuate racial inequality and white privilege. Structural racism requires a focus on the systems that produce the grossly unequal outcomes between racial groups. In essence, then, we should have our eyes on both how systems and institutions function to impact differential racial and ethnic communities, for therein lies how racial disparities arise. I'm going to fast forward. I have examples of it. Perhaps in the Q&A they'll come up. In closing, underprivileged communities of color and overprivileged white communities occur because of the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities. An analysis of the social development problems facing us in Nassau County should focus on the interaction between overprivileged and disadvantaged communities in our region, and on proposals to effect changes in the governance of Nassau-Suffolk, which is highly fragmented and perpetuates structural racism by producing racial and economic inequalities, often while appearing to be race neutral in their language. So there is much to be done. Thank you.